Hey, and welcome to something completely different. This is the first video in a new series I'm starting called Reviewing Games You Probably Haven't Played. My current plan is to do these as an occasional departure from my regular challenge run content. Today, we're going to be talking about Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth, which is probably the game you're most likely to have played out of the list of games I'm planning to review. It's a horror action survival game that was originally released in 2005 for the Xbox, and then in 2006 for PC. Despite the name, the game has very little to do with the Call of Cthulhu novella. It's more based off the scenario Escape from Innsmouth for the Chaosium TTRPG Call of Cthulhu game, which is in turn based on the H.P. Lovecraft story Shadow over Innsmouth. I haven't been able to get my hands on a copy of the scenario to see the differences for myself, but from other reviews it seems like the game follows the scenario pretty closely. This game is separated into 10 chapters, including the prologue, and I'll be going through each one by one, summarizing the events of the chapter and talking about new mechanics, problems, and general things I liked or didn't like that were introduced in each chapter, before wrapping things up with my final thoughts at the end. Without any further ado, let's get into the game. The game opens with a cutscene of our protagonist, Jack Walters, in Arkham Asylum, where he hangs himself. Then we go back 6.5 years, so clearly whatever's going to happen in this game, it's not going to end well. The prologue takes place at this old mansion that's housing a cult. The leader of the cult requested to speak with Jack specifically, and this whole opening chapter is excellent. Equal parts noir detective story and good old-fashioned Call of Cthulhu TTRPG one-shot. As soon as I'm given control of Jack, I realize that the controls are funky. It doesn't translate onto video real well, but it feels like I'm moving the camera through syrup. I try to change the mouse sensitivity, and the game crashes. Yeah, this is not the most stable piece of software. As Jack approaches the mansion, the cultists outside open fire, so we quickly run inside and start looking around. Most of the gameplay, especially in these early chapters, consists of walking around fairly linear levels in wonderfully dreary, culty, creepy places, getting spooked and learning secrets and finding key items that are used to progress. Any notes you find, as well as the occasional diary entry from Jack, can be accessed at any point by clicking on the book in the inventory screen. The UI overall is fine. My only real complaint is that the images for items in your inventory are extremely low resolution. It's not a big deal, since items have fairly detailed item descriptions, but it does show the game's age. These eye symbols are save point. At no point in the game is this communicated to the player. The game only has manual saving and the occasional autosave when you load into a new area. I'll be talking more about the save system once it starts breaking. Upstairs, we briefly see our first cultist before he bleeds out. This game is pretty gruesome and doesn't shy away from showing gore to the player. In this room, filled with a bunch of identical cultists who all drank the Kool-Aid, we're introduced to the sanity mechanic. It is extremely simple. If you see spooky things, your screen gets wobbly. And if you see lots of spooky things, your screen gets extremely wobbly. And you may hear spooky whispers. And your movement speed gets reduced a bit. It's really more annoying than anything else. Downstairs, we come across a room filled with pictures of Jack. It takes a bit of fiddling around with everything in the room before Jack acknowledges the creepy stalker boards. Weird hitbox issues for interactions are going to be a constant for the entirety of the game. In a piece of level design that I really like, approaching this mirror, where some weird noises are coming from, drops you down into a hidden corridor. It's easy to see if you know it's there, but just looks like more decrepit wallpaper if you don't. This sort of creative use of perspective in level design will never happen again. Heading down below the house, we find a morgue and some weird alien-looking technology. This is actually a pretty great hidden tutorial. This design of placing crystals into the crystal slots and then pressing the dial to turn on a portal is one of the few instances of a consistent mechanic, and it is greatly appreciated. This area also looks suitably alien, as you'd expect from a Cthulhu game. Jack then triggers a portal in a cutscene, and we cut to 6 years in the future, and 6 months before Jack hangs himself in Arkham. In the final cutscene of the prologue, Jack gets a call asking him to investigate a missing person, one Brian Burnham, who is working at the newly opened Innsmouth branch of the First National grocery store chain. The store was broken into around the same time that Brian went missing, but the store owner doesn't think Brian's responsible, and wants us to get to the bottom of things. Chapter 1 starts with Jack taking the bus into Innsmouth, and the vibe is immediately exactly as weird and inhospitable as it should be. The game opens up a bit here, or at least it gives the illusion of opening up. It's still very linear, but you can wander around and try to talk to the townsfolk and explore some of the side paths that lead to very little, but do quite a lot to help encourage the feeling of exploration. Getting to the back door of the First National introduces the stealth system. Oh boy, Thief Deadly Shadows this game is not. Enemies can theoretically see or hear you. I'll talk more about how the AI in this game is a bit lacking in the eye department when we get to the combat. Crouch walking makes you move silently, staying in shadows seems to do absolutely nothing, and the actual stealth mode is complete garbage. Seriously, don't use it. It's pointless and excruciatingly slow. In the First National, the game gives a tutorial on how to push heavy objects. And old memories of the most pants-shittingly terrifying moment of this game came flooding back to me. See, I've played this game before, at least the first couple hours, and it scared the hell out of me as a kid, and at this point I can see why. Even when there's nothing really going on, it still has a very tense and creepy atmosphere, and this will only get stronger as Chapter 1 progresses. It looks like some kind of animal broke into the place. Strange. After picking up some booze and a handle from the safe, one of the townsfolk starts trying to break down the back door. I just barricaded. And I'm introduced to the most difficult, dangerous enemy in this game. Ladders. Down below the store, we find Brian Burnham's diary, which tells us he was trying to get the hell out of Dodge with some unnamed girl. And oh, looky here, a room full of corpses. Very nice. Trying to find a way back to the town square leads us through the old Innsmouth newspaper office. We get the first ammo pickup here, which is weird, since it'll be at least an hour or two before I actually get a gun. It's also here that Jack has one of the most hilariously disrespectful reactions to find a dead person here I've ever seen.
This news broad must have kicked it a few months back.
Oh good, bolting doors. I remember what this is leading up to and I'm dreading it.
Hello, Jack.
Mackie here is a government worker who definitely isn't an FBI agent. He's never really important. He just kinda keeps showing up and being there. Arriving back at the town square, we get the first instance of Jack being able to see through the eyes of others. It's used to establish that Jack is being stalked by something and ramps up the tension, at first. With no clear short-term objective at this point, I just wander around until I find Zadok, the walking exposition dump. The short version of his long-ass drunken ramblings is that there's some pagan cult called the Order of Dagon ruling the town. The cult was founded by some guy named Obed Marsh and continues to be led by his family, and that we should take this key to get through the poorhouse and talk to Thomas White about the oaths of Dagon. It's not like I've got anywhere else to go right now, so off to the poorhouse it is. On the way, we're ambushed by Fancy Nancy Drew. She tells us that Brian was dating some chick named Ruth. She also tells us that the save points with stars are supposed to keep eldritch abominations at bay, but I literally never had any use for this function and can't even confirm whether or not it works. Heading to the poorhouse, we walk past Fishy Lady Nancy Drew. Jack mentions that he feels like he's being watched, and sure enough, yeah, that's pretty damn creepy. The early bits of this game have some really effective horror moments. It's not in-your-face scary, just very tense and unnerving, which I feel like is much more fitting for a Lovecraftian horror game anyways. The vision Jack gets while entering the poorhouse is particularly interesting, because you can actually look out the window here and see the creature you were just getting a POV shot from, which is a great way to establish that this isn't some psychosis or flashback. This is Jack seeing through the eyes of whatever these things are. Right here, right now. Be a shame if they started to just completely ignore the consistency they set up here. Walking up to this one particular nondescript house triggers a cutscene where we meet child Nancy Drew. Maybe I should explain here that this game has one female voice actor, and that voice actor is the wonderful Lonnie Manila, who voiced the titular bitchular in all of the Her interactive Nancy Drew games. Child Nancy Drew's mom has been turned into a horrifying fish monster, and oh boy, that is a whole lot of child murder down there, isn't it? Before you go downstairs, it's extremely important that you pick up the book in the fish mom's lair. It contains the key to solving one of the few actual puzzles in this game, and is very easy to miss. Thomas White has come home just in time to get his daughter's blood all over himself, give me the key to his variety store, and get arrested by the Order of Dagon. Fancy Nancy Drew shows up again to let us know that Brian is probably also in jail, and also so that Jack can tell her how guilty he feels and learn how to use health kits. When Jack takes damage, the injury will show up on the character model shown here on the inventory screen. Assuming that you have the right kind of healing item on you, you just have to click whichever square is red to trigger a brief but interruptible cutscene where Jack heals himself. I'm split on my opinion of this system. On one hand, it's nice that they've gone to the effort of actually building a full system for healing instead of just doing something bog standard and generic. On the other hand, later in the game, pretty much every time you get hit by anything, you'll get multiple wounds and are very limited on how many health items you can get. And if you get attacked by multiple enemies, it's very easy to die before you have a chance to heal. Interesting in theory, kinda shit in practice. Inside the variety store, we meet bratty Nancy Drew, or Ruth if you're boring. She fucks off and leaves us to try to open the safe. Safe code is really the only code in the entire game that isn't just given to you. You actually have to use a bit of reasoning to figure it out, based on that journal we found in the fish monster attic. It's also about as logically complex as the puzzles in this game are gonna get. Inside the safe is the Book of Dagon, an item that will sit uselessly in our inventory for the next several hours. This and the ammo are the only things that you get significantly before you need to use them. Basically everything else you pick up in the game is immediately used. Jack says that he doesn't want to spend the night in this town and that it's time to get the hell out of Dodge. So naturally, to progress the game, you have to get a hotel room for the night. You can eavesdrop on a conversation between the bus driver and the hotel manager, where they talk about how much they want to kill Jack. So, of course, after hearing that, we get a room and go to bed. But not before being left alone for just long enough to break into the hotel's back room, find the murder dungeon, pick up the murder journal, and see through the eyes of some random traveler who got murdered, because fuck consistency, I guess. I make sure to bolt all the doors before going to sleep and waking up in Chapter 2. Just keep the noise. The attack of the fishmen and the escape through the hotel is where this peaks as a horror game. All of the tension that's been building up through the eerie townsfolk, droning background music, mounting evidence that Jack is being stalked, and increasingly strange and hostile encounters, come to a fantastic crescendo as Jack is woken up by the townsfolk trying to break down his door. The music starts blasting and you have to race through the hotel, bolting and barricading your doors to buy yourself just enough time to escape out of a window. Then it's a mad dash to try to find safety and avoid the hail of bullets they rain down on you. It was really, really good. Right up until I got stuck on this ladder for like 3 minutes. That pretty effectively killed the mood. But even without my nemesis showing up, this is also just where the chase turns from a heart-pounding horror adventure spectacle to, well, honestly just a slog, because the game really wants you to do the rest of this chapter in stealth, and you could do that, but you could also just run past, or rather do the brisk walk that passes for a run in Jack's mind. The enemy aim is bad enough that as long as you're not standing still, a single enemy probably won't hit you. It's also incredibly inconsistent as to where you can or cannot be seen by an enemy, which makes stealth feel pretty awful. And most of the rest of the chapter is just more of that. You do occasionally get visions showing you enemy locations that you could, in theory, use to plan your route and avoid enemies, but between the jarring POV shots coming out of nowhere, then only lasting a few seconds, and the player not having seen this part of the level before makes them less helpful than I think they were intended to be. In a brief taste of the action-y shenanigans to come, Jack rides past a group of enemies in the back of an out-of-control truck, which sends him careening into the sewers, where I can move through the town without being chased by fishmen. At this point, Jack starts really losing it, seeing and hearing dead child Nancy Drew around every corner, in the sewers and occasionally out and about after that. Now, I said that the chase was where the scare factor of this game peaks, and I meant it, but it still has its moments.
Oh, God. It's the old fisherman, Zadok Allen.
In an excellent example of the level of quality we're dealing with in the enemy AI here, you're supposed to use these grates to lead the enemies away from the sewer exit so that you can sneak into this burning building. You don't need to do that though. As long as they're not blocking the exit, you can just run past. I got clipped, but at this point in the game, healing supplies are so plentiful that it doesn't matter. Jack conveniently and unknowingly breaks into Fancy Nancy Drew's house, and she tells us that there should be a way to get to the jail through the basement of the nearby church. One quick thing about the dialogue: the game prioritizes what dialogue is played based only off what was triggered most recently, which led to this unintentionally hilarious moment from Sociopath Jack.
She's dead.
The rest of Chapter 2 is about 15 minutes of parkouring my way to the jailhouse. The parkour is surprisingly okay. It's nothing particularly fun or exciting, but it's functional and generous enough that it works with the clunky movement. Also, Mackie sort of just shows up and says hi. Chapter 3 is where things really start to go downhill. I was taking notes during my playthrough, and at the start of Chapter 3 I just wrote, "Got crowbar. Things can only go downhill from here." And I was right. This game falls face first into the pitfall that most horror survival games do. The second you get a weapon is the same second that the game loses all sense of tension and fear. That's especially true in this game because the combat system is mostly just a source of frustration. The crowbar is especially awful because its hitbox is incredibly janky and will often just phase through enemies doing no damage. I eventually realized that I could abuse the fishman's brain damage by sprinting upstairs and only fighting the one enemy that's actually in the jail. Luckily, we're not stuck with the whacking stick for long because there's also a pistol and a shotgun in the jail.
It's unlocked.
Releasing Brian from his cell leads to the game's first and worst escort mission. There are a couple of these, and this was the only one I had trouble with. Mostly because Brian just ran off into the road and got himself shot immediately. So I decided to play things safe and take out all the nearby fishmen before releasing Brian. Which brings me to gunplay. The main issue with the guns is that the controls are just unresponsive. I cannot tell you how many times I died because I hit the reload or change weapon button and the game just didn't do the thing. Other than that though, the shooting overall is fine. There's enough difference between the guns to actually make it worthwhile to switch up what weapons you're using to suit the situation. Until the final chapter, that is. Another pretty goofy thing with the guns is that it seems like the enemy's hearing range is a constant value. So it's the same whether they're hearing your footsteps or your gunfire. So if you stand a bit a ways away, you can just snipe enemies and they'll just kind of stand there. Jack has to lead Brian over to this warehouse so he can fix a truck that we can use to get the fuck out. And this part really pissed me off. Brian refuses to leave until you get a brooch that belongs to his girlfriend, and just, really? This feels like the devs just trying to waste your time. I had to backtrack to the area I was just in, fight enemies I just fought that respawned, and opened a safe I already found the code for but wasn't allowed to open because the game said no. Oh, also Mackie showed up again. I leave downtown Innsmouth in Chapter 3 by hanging out in an on-rails shooter section, minus most of the shooter part. There are enemies to shoot at, but you're moving so fast and their aim is so terrible that it's mostly just a waste of ammo to shoot at anything except the exploding barrel you have to shoot to continue. Brian fucks off to somewhere unexplained and leaves us to track down Bratty Nancy Drew so we can leave. Chapter 4 starts off by spitting like 5 dudes with guns at you. The thing about combat in this game is that 1 or 2 enemies are an absolute joke, but any more than that at a given time is instant death, with how punishing the damage Jack takes is. Luckily, there's nothing stopping me from just leaving, and this is almost always the better option. There's really not a whole lot to say about Chapter 4. It's really just more of the same frustrating stealth and combat encounters that are better handled by just running past them. I picked up the revolver, which is like the pistol but does a bit more damage at the cost of firing speed and a smaller magazine, and the Tommy gun, which is complete garbage. Jack saves Bratty Nancy Drew only for her and Brian to immediately eat it in an ambush. There's an incredibly boring 10-minute cutscene in which Jack is strapped to a bed in the sanatorium he's been in for a few weeks since he escaped from Innsmouth. It can be summarized as followed. This is Agent Hoover of the FBI. He's an asshole. Jack's going back to Innsmouth to help him expose the gold smuggling shenanigans that Hoover thinks is going down in the refinery, and arrest the Marsh family. Why Jack? Because he's the player character. Why is Jack agreeing to this? Because Hoover says so, I guess. From here on out, it's basically an entirely different story with nothing to do with anything that's happened so far, and this premise is only loosely connected to the rest of the events of the game. Basically, the game goes from a janky but generally well put together Call of Cthulhu one-shot to a rushed mess of a Delta Green scenario. We roll up to the Marsh refinery only to be shot at from a Gatling gun. Hoover sends Jack to go up and deal with it because he's the main character, I guess. At least Jack has the decency to sound as confused as I am as to why we're the ones doing this. Inside the refinery, I pick up one of the best guns in the game, the rifle. It can one-shot most enemies, and gives 5 shots before needing to reload. Hoover goes full-on Delta Green, and we follow his example and murder our way through the refinery. Most of this level is a less than mediocre corridor shooter with infinitely respawning enemies. The goal of this section is to turn on some generators to get the elevator upstairs working. This is also the point where the save system broke. I honestly don't know how they managed to fuck this up this badly. It doesn't just not save the game. Whenever I try to save, it overwrites the save with data from saves that should have been erased sometime between a few hours to 6 fucking years ago. I have no idea what caused this or how to fix it or how it's even possible from a technical standpoint. During my research, though, I found that the general consensus is that the GOG version of this game is significantly more stable, so I picked it up and replayed the entire game up to the Marsh Refinery, and it did the same damn thing. It was overall more stable, though, with consistently higher frame rates and the ability to actually load the game while not in the title menu without everything crashing. I also looked up several old guides and forums, and while I didn't find anyone else having this exact issue, I did find the IGN guide for this game, which is hilarious. My eventual solution was to just try to save my game over and over for like 3 minutes until it finally decided to cooperate. But enough of me bitching about this broken nonsense, back to the actual gameplay. The first section of the refinery is kind of like a Resident Evil type deal with the combat and the running around trying to solve little micro puzzles to progress, except it's not very good. It doesn't help that the refinery, like the actual space we're moving around in, is really fucking boring. Just lots of cement and boxes. The puzzles are a little too simple and way too mundane. Things finally get interesting when you hop on this conveyor belt and stumble into Jacob Marsh, who turns on the conveyor belt and runs away like a little bitch. Then it's the little cat and mouse game, where you chase Jacob around the refinery for a while as he sends groups of goons at you to try to slow you down. We take the elevator down, and it's more of the same, initially at least. We do get a bit of a scenery change with the lava and the gold processing, and oh hey, it's Hoover, playing damsel in distress. I was extremely tempted to just let him die because, good God, I do not care about this character or anything that's going on. That would probably have meant that I'd have to load my last save, and I just want this chapter to be over. That's really the main problem concerning the story past Chapter 3. The player just isn't given any reason to care about what's going on. The first 3 chapters gave the player enough time in Innsmouth to at least get a little invested in the characters, but everything after that just kind of feels like you're just along for the ride while the story happens around you. And the story it's trying to tell isn't nearly interesting enough for a narrative like that. Case in point, Hoover decides that change of plans, now we're supposed to kill Jacob. Because Jacob left his briefcase, and Hoover just divines that there will be enough evidence in it to get a full-scale raid on this place. And if that's the case, why don't we just leave and go do that? Roughly halfway through Chapter 5, we change gears and start building up towards the first boss of the game. And it's not Jacob. I use the term boss loosely because it's really more of an environmental set piece that pops up occasionally, but you do kill it at the end, and so I feel like it counts more than it doesn't. Lots of eyes? Check. Lots of goop? Check. Yep, that's a shugga. Jacob comes out of literally nowhere to knock Jack out and steal all of his shit, so I don't even have the option to fight it. Even when the Shoggoth isn't breaking, blocking the way you're supposed to go, it's not good. There's no time constraint and it doesn't deal a threatening amount of damage, so it's really just more of the same shit from the first half of the level, but with this horrendous screeching and wobbly screen effects. Spoiler alert for later, but the bosses in this game are awful. The Shoggoth isn't even that bad comparably. After the environmental puzzle stuff, you just have to walk through a linear path while it screams at you and fucks with your vision. It's not interesting, but it's also unlikely you'll have to play through it more than once, because it's very unlikely it'll kill you. See this? This is what I was talking about with the plot. Jack gets up, and turns out we've been fucking around downstairs for no reason, because Hoover and his goons have arrested Jacob off-screen, which I guess means we're back to taking him alive, despite the last order Hoover gave us to kill him. Hoover sends Jack back down into the bowels of the refinery for literally no reason. Seriously, Hoover has what he came here for. Jack doesn't want to be here. Hoover's men are planting explosives to bring down the building for literally no reason. Things just happen, and they don't make sense, and the game doesn't bother to even try to get the player to care about them. I may have been a little frustrated at the game at this point, if you couldn't tell. One thing that's honestly reason enough to buy the GOG version over the Steam version is that ladders aren't nearly as much of a menace. I was able to reliably get on and off ladders the way I expected to be able to throughout the rest of the game. Alright, time for round 2 with the Shoggoth, and despite having a weapon, now it's still an environmental puzzle boss. This time we release a bunch of flammable gas into the room it's in and blow it up. Under the refinery is some spooky Cthulhu temple nonsense and an Indiana Jones style puzzle to get the key item, and then we leave and watch the refinery explode, again, for literally no reason in a cutscene. Chapter 6 begins with Jack taking part in a military assault on the snowy shores of Innsmouth. Jack is a PI. Why is he here? We learn in a text dump that we're supposed to find a smuggler's tunnel that we can use to find and arrest Roberts Marsh. For reasons. A side note, the problems with the save system seem to be entirely localized to the Marsh refinery level, as it's working normally now, and will continue to do so for the rest of the game. At the smuggler's entrance, we see our first thrall. There are only a couple of these in the game, which is good because they are impervious to bullets, but not to fire. So I guess Jack's just on a solo mission to find and arrest Jacobs now, again for basically no reason. Won't lie, these starfish things got me pretty good the first time I encountered them. Solid spook and a fun moment. That's the most frustrating thing about this game. It isn't all awful. It has plenty of these fun little moments. It's just that the ratio between the fun and the bullshit isn't nearly high enough in the fun's favor. Mackie's also back, but locked in a cell for now. Moving through the level, we end up in actually a very nice mansion. It's a welcome change of scenery and reminiscent of the prologue. This whole chapter is surprisingly fun. I mean, I got extremely frustrated about the lack of communication as to what the hell I was actually supposed to be doing, but exploring this building is pretty fun. There are a couple hidden passages, you get the knife for stealth kills, and it leans a lot more into the culty weirdness that makes Lovecraftian horror so fun. Remember that book of Dagon we picked up way back in Chapter 1? Yeah, that's finally useful. It's used to translate the esoteric texts scattered across the mansion. Turns out the actual objective for really the rest of the game is to break this barrier here that... Hold up. Is that supposed to be the yellow sign? That's not even kind of a Dagon thing. Haster has nothing to do with this story. Having cleared out the mansion and picked up a key to the cells down below the mansion, it's time to free Mackie because we need an extra set of hands. I wish I had been recording my reaction while playing, because when Mackie took one step into this room I need him to be in, and then turned on his heel and ran away, I shrieked at my computer. Once he finally gets his ass in gear, we can, and here I'll quote the lovely IGN guide, head down into the ritual chamber like a jackass. And this last encounter of Chapter 6 made me audibly say what the fuck when these two goofy dudes started chucking magic balls at me. Jack tries to follow Roberts, to what end I have no idea, since we have no means of arresting him. This is actually a pretty solid puzzle here. There's a clue that's sort of cryptic, but clear enough to get you started. and I actually got a vision earlier that functions as a clue. It expects the player to have retained some information and used the environment to work out what the code is. This tiny little thing is the best puzzle in the game, and the last piece of gameplay in Chapter 6. In a cutscene, Jack falls into the ocean and gets picked up by the Coast Guard, and the entirety of this chapter takes place on a ship. Another complete change of scenery. The cold metal interior and dark rainy sea outside set the mood quite nicely. I'm given the opportunity to explore the interior and familiarize myself with the layout, which will be important for later. Narratively, this is by far the most simplistic chapter of the game, but that's not a bad thing. We have a single clear objective: survive until we reach the coast. The main obstacle for this objective is the continuous assault from Deep Ones on the ship throughout the chapter. The first few objectives involve alternating between killing waves of Deep One on the deck and being sent to get items from various rooms in the ship to keep our allies on the deck fighting for longer. Then some witches on the coast summon hell waves, which we have to brace against. Between waves, we use the ship's cannon to turn those witches into blood mist. This is another of the very few instances of a solid hidden tutorial. It's a relatively low-stakes situation that allows the player to get comfortable with the cannon controls before it's used for the fight at the end of the chapter. After doing that a couple times, we go with the 2 survivors from the assault below deck to relative safety. There's some climbing around vents in the underbelly of the ship to try to get our merry little band of survivors deeper into the ship to be safer. During this, Jack gets occasional visions that show something coming up towards us from the deep. The Deep Ones mess up the engine, so we need to go unmess up the engine. Some more light puzzles and combat encounters ensue until we get it up and running again, then go back up to the deck where we have the climax of the chapter. Well, that's what it's supposed to be. It's a boss fight with Dagon himself, and it's not very good. You just have to stand next to the cannon and try to avoid the paw swipes until Dagon decides it's time to pop up in front of the ship, where you can blast him with the cannon. I praised the hidden tutorial for the cannon mechanic, but unfortunately its final use is just... well, it's mostly just tedious. Especially because where Dagon appears seems to be actually random, instead of being pseudo-random or having a mercy system. That's a fancy way of saying it took me like 10 minutes for the giant scaly asshole to actually move somewhere I could hit him. He eventually dies and drags us down into the deep with him. Chapter 8 starts with Jack washing ashore on a coastal cove. At this point in the story, Jack is just trying to survive and find a way out. The theme of this chapter is traps. Most of them are bullshit. I just have to progress along a linear cave system, finding and using key items and not touching anything with a weird texture. At the end of the path, there's this puzzle. Apparently this thing here is a map. My directionally challenged ass couldn't make sense of how it was supposed to correspond to the paths, but luckily there's also some glowing red rocks you can follow to get to the spooky Cthulhu room. Jack confirms that it, in fact, was Dagon we fought at the end of the last chapter, and not just a really big, deep one. Then, to end things out, we just have to drop down this windy hole. And I don't really have anything to say about this entire chapter. It's incredibly short, simple, and nothing really happens. Chapter 9, on the other hand, is incredibly long, overly complicated, and way too much happens, and very little of it makes sense in the context of the rest of the game. Basically, that tunnel spits us out in an underwater cave system inhabited by more Deep Ones. This view gave me legitimate anxiety, but I'm also very easily freaked out by deep water, so make of that what you will. Jack almost immediately gets arrested, and we're gearless. Again. And in prison, so unfortunately we actually have to engage with the cell system. There are too many enemies to even survive a run from where we start to where we need to be. Luckily, little side tunnels are abundant in this level. Unluckily, that means I'll be spending most of the rest of the game staring at this stone texture, because until I get my shit back, It's mostly just going to be moving from tunnel to tunnel. At one point, I came across a green crystal that looks awfully familiar, but for some stupid reason, the chisel isn't enough to get it out of the wall. I was so ready to be done with this game at this point. To descend into the deeper, wetter caves, we have to pass through this cave garden. If I was smart, I would have picked up this clearly interactable blue plant because it's a key item for later. A little further, and Jack can eavesdrop on a conversation where we learn that a barrier is being kept up by Mother. Surely not Mother Hydra, right? I mean, killing one Lovecraftian god is a touch ridiculous, but two of the Marsh siblings get pissed off at each other, and one is a wizard. The wizard gets shot and murders the other Marsh, and then Jack, in his infinite stupidity, falls through the ceiling, and now it's time for the first boss of this chapter. This fight fucking sucks. You have to pick up the knife that's on the table, but incredibly difficult to see and not telegraphed to the player at all. And you have to just kind of stab him a few times and pray to whatever gods you believe in that you kill him before he kills you. After the fight, you have to pick up a couple more items from the completely innocuous looking briefcase that doesn't look important at all to get back the Book of Dagon and a key. Then make another incredibly important but easily missable detour to pick up this rifle here. Yeah, the game really just completely gives up on communicating anything to the player in the last chapter. I guess our goal is to break whatever barrier that Mother is creating, but I honestly don't even know why. The only thing I can think of is that yellow barrier in the mansion, but what purpose that would even serve at this point is beyond me.
It's an ancient statue of good.
With a gun back in my hands, I go take my frustration out on all these fishy bastard men that I was forced to stealth past earlier. The key we picked up is for this random-ass laboratory, because you can't have a spooky cult compound without a mad scientist laboratory. On my way to the lab, I nearly ended my playthrough for good when a cutscene bumped me out of bounds. Honestly, for how much this game seems like it runs purely on spaghetti, I'm shocked that this is the only time I've been zapped into the Shadow Realm. Luckily, for this video and my sanity, an enemy pushes me back in bounds, somehow, and I'm able to kill my savior and proceed to the lab. In the lab, there's some pesticide, which seems completely random at this point, and a book talking about a poisonous plant. Oh, also this experiment that I decided can get knifed out of its misery. Mostly because he gave me some of the worst video game advice ever. Explore the abandoned areas. It's a fucking cave. It all looks abandoned. And it doesn't even matter because there's only one way I can go. This random, indistinguishable item in a vision is Jack's equipment. I only realized this several minutes after picking it up when I accidentally pulled one of my old guns out. There's a living plant, so I used the pesticide on it because we seem to have devolved entirely into 90s click-and-point adventure game logic. If something is interactable, use every item in your inventory on it until something happens. Oh hey, another portal. We actually know how these work. It's missing a crystal, so I assume I need to find a way to get that crystal from earlier out and activate the portal so we can leave. Remember that poison plant we learned about just a second ago? Yeah. Well, to progress, you have to feed that to a monster in this cell. What indicates that you need to get into the cell? Absolutely fucking nothing. But when I do eventually get in there, I find a hammer that I can use with the chisel to get the green crystal out. We really are operating on 90s point-and-click adventure game logic. On the way back to the portal, this happens. This will happen quite a bit, and it's loud and grating as shit every single time. I fire up the portal and it teleports me about 10 feet, which is just so incomprehensibly stupid to me. Why was this thing programmed to teleport people 10 feet away, other than because video game? Ugh. I got a lightning gun. It's strong and doesn't need ammo. I won't be using any other weapon for the rest of the game. I spent way too long trying to figure out what to do here. This part isn't even that obtuse. I just forgot that there was a side tunnel I found on my way to the boss fight that I never went down. It's a tunnel filled with water and starfish. And lightning gun plus water is an electrifying combination. Just make sure you aren't standing in the water when you zap it. This kills all the starfish things, so I can get past without being poisoned to death. Time for the second boss fight of the game. This one actually isn't half bad. I found this to be the most enjoyable fight of the game because it's actually a fight. It's got pretty simple mechanics and an absolutely fucking horrifying boss design if you don't know what's coming. The flying polyps use wind powers to try to knock you off this bridge and damage you. I did accidentally find a safe spot on the other side of the bridge where I was safe from most of the attacks and could pop out and shoot a polyp with a charged lightning shot. Like I said, simple but pretty enjoyable. The boss design probably does pull a lot of weight, but I had a pretty good time with it. That cannot be said for the third and final boss fight of Chapter 9. You're basically thrown from one right into the other. The brood mother here has some worshippers you have to deal with, and then you have to do something. I'll be honest, I looked up a guide here because I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing and wasn't willing to spend any more time in this game than I had to. And after looking at the guide, how long did it take people to figure this out? This is so incomprehensible. The only things hinting at what you're supposed to do is this vision, where we see someone sitting in the water, and the fact that you can interact with the gong. That is not enough information to know how to defeat this boss. Here are the actual steps you have to take to finish this stupid game. First, you have to fire a fully charged lightning shot at this gong, giving everyone tinnitus, which, why? This is awful. Then you have to kill the wave of enemies that spawn. Then you have to stand in this water until the game decides you've soaked your toes long enough. Then you take control of a deep one that spawns off screen. Then you have to jump up behind one of these statues that's way higher than anything we've been able to jump to for the entire game. And there's absolutely no indication that there's anything of note behind here. Then you get booted out of the deep one, fight another wave of enemies, and do all of that 3 more times. And then finally, you can kill the Mother Hydra by zapping the pool. I'm pretty sure Jack's voice actor also stopped giving a shit because listen to the delivery of this ancient eldritch magical chant.
Behuin and Kugnath, Fanu Naemna, Bagliz Kafungin, Kathavahel, Koth Cthulhu Kafungni, Rigazengaro, Hydra.
What's our reward for defeating the second elder god of the day? A gaudy piece of jewelry and a missile to the face. Not so fun when it's happening to you now, is it, Jack? Maybe show Dagon some respect, Jack. God, this game is so draining. The last bit of actual gameplay is just running back to the beginning of the area. But you have to avoid every single one of these randomly falling rocks that seem to have targeting guidance with the way they fling themselves at you. If you get hit once, you'll get injured. And if you get injured, you will, without fail, die before you get to the end. There's no reason the timing needs to be this tight when the camera is so fucked. After several tries, I get to the end and wait for Jack to give the most lethargic eldritch chant ever. Then I get teleported back to the mansion where, once again, Mackie is just sorta there. Then we cut to a cutscene of Jack hanging himself in an asylum a few months later, bringing us full circle. And that's Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, story and mechanics. Well, not quite, actually. If you've played this game before, first of all, I'm so sorry. You might have noticed that I completely neglected to mention a few very plot-relevant cutscenes, namely everything having to do with the Great Race of Yith. I did this to demonstrate that the Yithian aspect of the plot contributes absolutely nothing to this game except for confusion if you're not already very familiar with the Cthulhu mythos. So let's run through all the Yith bits real quick and talk about why there shouldn't be any Yith bits. At the end of the prologue, after you switch on the portal, a Yith strolls in and chitters at Jack before the first time skip. Then we're treated to Jack monologuing about how he doesn't remember anything from the last 6 years, and it seems almost as if he was an entirely different person during that time. If you're familiar with the stories of the great race of Yith, you'd know that they have the ability to remotely body swap with people, explaining Jack's memory loss, this second personality, probably Jack's visions, and most crucially, the final cutscene. None of this is communicated in the game. There's one teeny tiny scene of Jack chatting with some Yith at the beginning of Chapter 2. This scene, in the transition between Chapters 8 and 9, that I think are flashbacks of Jack's time with the Yith. And then the game ends with a cutscene depicting a conversation between Jack and a Yith during that 6-year gap of missing time. They talk about the deep ones in the underwater city, and maybe this would have been relevant if the game had gotten its planned sequels, but it didn't. So this scene is left feeling like a half-assed attempt to actually tie Jack to the events that take place in the last 2/3 of the game, after the fact. And even then, it only works if you're already familiar with the Cthulhu mythos, because again, the game communicates literally nothing about the Yith in the game itself, and the player is given no indication of when or where this scene is taking place. Removing these aspects actually makes the game make more sense, because you aren't being thrust into these seemingly random instances of disjoint strangeness. So, Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth. Should you play it? No, probably not. It's a janky, unfocused mess that falls apart before your eyes while you play it. The worst thing about this game is how strong the beginning is. It's still janky, for sure, but it's a legitimately good little investigative horror game. The second combat gets introduced, every flaw of the game just gets put on full display. The narrative feels like it's two completely separate games, carelessly mashed together. The first, a focused, linear investigation of the strange goings-on in Innsmouth. The second, a poorly strung together excuse to move the player from mediocre set piece to mediocre set piece. Overall, I'd give this game a 2 out of 5. It has some interesting things, particularly in the beginning, but overall, really not worth the 10 or so hours it takes to play it. That's gonna do it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.